Okay, so as I said, in interest of time, I'm sort of going to hurry through this by sort of doing the thing that I never do and that I said that no one should ever do, which is read the paper. So as I said, there was a time when people took indexicality to be, I mean, that's well documented, to be a property of language and of language exclusively. That is, they thought that thought itself could not be indexical. They thought there was an a priori argument that it could not be indexical any more than it could be ambiguous. And then came the discovery of the essential indexical, all the examples. And so, and what it seems to show is that if you remove, in some cases, if you remove the indexical from a sentence, then that changes the nature of the thought that is expressed. So that was really demonstrated by those examples. So I have a quote from Stolnaker that actually makes this point. He says, in these cases, there seems to be no way to eliminate the indexical element in the expression of the attitude without distorting the content. So you don't have that quote on the handout. So I think that this established, or seems to establish, that the thought expressed by uttering an indexical sentence is itself indexical, in some sense of indexical. I have no qualms with using indexical for thought as well as language. There is something common that has to be captured. Of course, it's not exactly the same thing, but there is some commonality. So indexicality is essential to the extent that it is a feature of thought itself and not merely of the linguistic means through which thought is expressed. So what's interesting is to, as I said, the philosophers at the time thought it was clear that there could not be indexicality in thought. So there was an argument for this impossibility. And it's certainly worth looking at what the argument was. Of course, the argument was rarely ever made explicit. So you have to do some reconstruction, which I'm doing here. I think the argument is this, basically. Thought itself could not be indexical any more than it could be ambiguous. And here is why. Indexicality, like ambiguity, has to do with the relation between the sentence and the thought that the sentence expresses. So if we abstract from the relation by considering only the thought itself, one of the relata, then the notions of ambiguity or indexicality, because they are relational notions, they no longer apply. It is therefore a category mistake to ask whether thought itself is or might be indexical. So to see how the argument works, consider ambiguity. Actually, the argument has been made explicit in the case of ambiguity, and I believe to get the argument for indexicality, you just have to reuse the same materials. So consider the case of ambiguity. Ambiguity is a property that is instantiated whenever the same sentence, or what looks like the same sentence superficially, expresses distinct thoughts. If we abstract from the linguistic expression of thoughts and consider the thoughts themselves, no room is left for ambiguity. The thoughts themselves cannot be ambiguous, only the linguistic expression can. So that's the argument. And you find it in the quote from J. Fodor, the first quote on your handouts. And Fodor was one of the early opponents of both mental ambiguity and mental indexicality. I definitely remember that he was against anything like mental indexicality. So he says, in this quote, whereas it is thought that equivocal sentences equivocate between, there doesn't seem to be anything comparable around that could serve to disequivocate thought. So if this argument against mental ambiguity were correct, it would apply to mental indexicality as well. Indexicality is a property that is instantiated when a given sentence expresses distinct thoughts, different thoughts in different contexts, and no thoughts independent of context. If we abstract, let's suppose that's how we characterize indexicality. I'm going to say that this is question beginning in a minute. If we abstract from the linguistic expression of thought and consider the thoughts themselves, no room is left for indexicality. As we might put it, paraphrasing Fodor, whereas it is thoughts that indexical sentences express with respect to context, there does not seem to be anything comparable around that thoughts themselves could express with respect to context. Thoughts don't express anything, they are what we express. Therefore, no mental indexicality. Now, yes, that's the older version I now see, but it doesn't matter. I probably didn't save the right changes I made. So I think this argument is question-begging because it presupposes a certain conception of thought, a certain notion of thought, which we may call the Freudian notion, or maybe the Freudo-Russell notion, though Freudo doesn't talk of thoughts, but it presupposes a certain conception, and as soon as you accept this conception, there no longer can be any mental indexicality in virtue of the argument, but there is no reason why we should accept the conception. And the conception basically is the conception of thought as necessarily having absolute truth conditions. And I think that conception of thought is implicit in the claim that indexical sentences express different thoughts in different contexts. That shouldn't be conceded, that indexical sentences express different thoughts in different contexts, at least in the context of discussing this issue of mental indexicality, because that is what is at stake. So there is this notion of thought as absolutely truth evaluable, as having fixed and absolute truth conditions. So if you change the truth conditions, you change the thought. But there is another notion of thought, which is actually a more ancient notion, which has been around for much longer than the Freudo-Russell notion. So for example, that's a notion, the alternative notion is a notion that Hintika ascribes to Aristotle and the Stoics, and many people have appealed to that notion. And actually, Hintika recommends that alternative notion of thought as very natural. He thinks it's more natural than the Freudo-Russell notion. So you've got the Hintika quotes on your handout, and I'm reading the quotes. It is obvious, he says, that the sentence "it is raining," as uttered by me today, is made true or false by a set of facts different from those facts that verified or falsified my utterance yesterday of "it's raining." So the idea is that it's raining today and it's raining yesterday. These two utterances have different truth conditions. But, Hintika says, it is very natural to say that in some sense, the state of mind or attitude towards my environment that is expressed by the two utterances is the same. The facts to which yesterday's utterance refers are referred to today by the sentence, "it was raining yesterday." But the state of mind that this utterance appears to express seems entirely different from that expressed by yesterday's present tense utterance, "it is raining." Hence, the idea that spoken words are symbols for unspoken thoughts encourages the idea that one and the same temporary indefinite form of words expresses one and the same belief or opinion at different times when it is uttered. The idea is that there is one notion of thought such that when you think "it's raining" at different times, you're thinking the same thoughts, even though the truth conditions change. So on this view, indexical thoughts may be characterized as thoughts whose absolute truth conditions are not fixed once for all, but depend upon the context. When I think "it is raining at T," the thought is true if and only if it is raining at T. When I think the same thought at T prime, the thought is true if and only if it is raining at T prime. The content of such a temporal thought is a property of times, which the thinker applies to the time of thought. And that gets the right truth conditions. If the time of thought varies, the truth conditions vary. So that was sort of view put forward by Arthur Pryor. And it's analogous to Lewis' take on the décès, as you realize. According to Lewis's interpretation of the Perry example, Himson and Hume both think, "I wrote the treatise," or "I am Hume." They think the same thought, but the absolute truth conditions of the thought depends upon the context of tokening. When thought by Hume, the thought is true if and only if Hume wrote the treatise, or Hume is Hume. When thought by Himson, it is true if and only if Himson is Hume, or Himson wrote the treatise. One way of putting the matter is to say that the thought is true at Hume, but false at Himson, where Hume and Himson serve as the relevant point of evaluation for the thought. Just as "it is raining" on the view under consideration is true at T, but false at T prime, or possibly false at T prime. Okay, so there is this alternative notion of thought. Now let's reconsider the argument against mental indexicality. It says that indexicality is a relational matter, It's a property of the expression relation between sentences and thoughts. And the argument says that if we look at thoughts themselves and abstract from their linguistic expression, the expression relation disappears from view and the notion of indexicality no longer applies. But if, following Hintika and Lewis and others, we reject the notion, the sort of Freudian notion of thought, or we reject the stipulation regarding the absolute truth evaluability of thoughts, then we can respond to the argument by pointing out that there is a relation which we can make use of, that we can use to make sense of the idea of mental indexicality. And it is the relation between the thought and its absolute truth conditions. The thought it is raining has different truth conditions when it is thought at t and when it is thought at t prime. And likewise for Lewis, the thought I'm Hume has different truth conditions when thought by Hume and when thought by Hampson. So the thought truth conditions pairing is relative to context. And this is sufficient to make the notion of indexicality applicable to the mental realm. Now, I want to, some people may be unpleased by the fact that I seem to be rejecting the Freudian notion of thought, which is, has so much advantageous and that we like for many purposes. But we don't need to reject that notion, actually. Everything I've said can be said even if we stick to a Freudian notion of content as absolutely truth evaluable. So for Frege, a complete thought content can only be true or false. Tertium non dater. So you've got the Frege quotation on the handout. I'm not going to go into that. So a thought cannot be true at t and false at t prime on Frege's account. It wouldn't be a complete thought. Or it couldn't be true at x and false at y. That wouldn't be a complete thought. So since the alleged thought that it is raining is true when entertained on a rainy day and false when entertained on a sunny day, that shows that it's not a genuine thought by Freudian standards. It's not a complete content. Now I think we can accept that stipulation. We can accept that notion of a complete content of Freudian thought and still make sense of the alternative notion of thought. They are not incompatible at all. They are perfectly compatible. And that's something I pointed out in many places. So we can say that the complete content of an utterance of its raining, or the Freudian thought, if you want, depends upon two factors, one internal and one external. Of course, that's a very familiar view. The internal factor is the Aristotelian thought that is expressed, the state of mind or attitude towards the environment, as Hintika puts it. And the external factor is the time at which the Aristotelian thought is expressed or entertained. Without the external factor, no complete thought content in Frege's sense would be expressed, something that Frege himself says in the case of indexical sentences. He needs, in order to have a complete thought, you need to add an element from the context, namely the time or something like that. Without the external factor, no complete thought content in Frege's sense would be expressed. But the internal factor has an important role to play. It is meant to capture what is common to all of those who think it is raining and who behave accordingly in their respective contexts. So at this point, we can help ourselves to what I find an extremely useful situation theoretic notion, that of an Austinian proposition, where an Austinian proposition has two components. One component is just what we may call a relativized proposition, something that's not a classical proposition, something that has truth at conditions, relativized truth conditions. So it's true at x or true at t, but it's not true or false, or not necessarily true or false absolutely. So that's one component. And the other component, and that component can be modeled as a set of centered worlds, as many people now advocate. So the proposition that one is Hume would be such a relativized proposition, true at some persons, namely true at Hume, but false at other persons, and false at Hampson in particular. Now, the other component of the Austinian proposition just is the index relative to which the first component is to be evaluated. So that's the relevant center, if you think in terms of centered worlds. So in the case at hand, the index is either Hume or Hampson, depending on the context. So this gives us two Austinian propositions corresponding to the complete content of the respective utterances. So you have that under 4 in the handout. So these are representations of the two Austinian propositions. And they, of course, in contrast to the relativized proposition, which is one component of the Austinian proposition. So the relativized proposition only has truth at conditions or relativized truth conditions. It doesn't have absolute truth conditions or need not have any. So it's only true at certain indices and false at others. But in contrast to the relativized proposition, the Austinian proposition has absolute truth conditions, classical truth conditions. It is true if and only if the relativized proposition is true at the relevant index. So the Austinian proposition with its absolute truth conditions is the complete content. It determines a set of possible worlds, the worlds in which the Austinian proposition is true. While the relativized proposition is the psychological content, the subjective or internal aspect of content. So in saying all this, I've sort of used ideas from Louis, I've sort of mixed ideas from many people, and I would like to say, as a comment on something that has been said during our previous workshop, that I don't think of the Louis framework and the Perry framework as alternatives. So it was said in one of the talks that I said gave arguments for the Louis alternative as opposed to Perry's view. Not at all. I think they are equivalent. I think that's false advertisement that, for example, Louis has only one level of content while Perry has two. No, it's exactly the, well, I think it's equivalent. I can't really go into that in detail. Now, John, I think, comes to think along similar lines when he describes the Louis view and says basically that he disagrees on mostly the terminological choice of using self-ascription. I like self-ascription, but to make you happier with it, why don't we should instead use primitive self-ascription for the Louis notion. I think that would be fine. And of course, that's different from ordinary self-ascription. Okay, now I turn to John's views and the criticism that's been recurrent in the literature and that I wanted to address. John locates indexicality not in the content of belief, but like Indica, in the belief states through which the content is apprehended. Well, by content here, I mean the complete content. Or more accurately, in the relation between the content and the belief states. So Hume and Heimson are in the same belief state for Perry, but the content of their beliefs are different. One believes that Hume is Hume, the other believes that Heimson is Hume. Distinct contents are represented to them under the same mode of presentation, where the mode of presentation is the internal bit. It's also possible for the same content to be presented under distinct modes of presentation, as in Kaplan's my pants are on fire, his pants are on fire example. Indexicality goes together with these possibilities, same state, different contents, different states, same content, as was made perfectly clear in Perry's early articles on these issues. Now, some philosophers are unhappy with the appeal to belief states or modes of presentation. That started long ago, in the 70s, actually, when I was in Oxford. Neo-Freudians, such as John McDowell and Gareth Evans, launched an attack on what they called the two-component picture of the mind. They argued that the so-called internal component, what I've been calling the internal component, is not an ingredient of content at all, but is the vehicle, the bearer of content. So we shouldn't think of contents as somehow involving two components. That's a mistake. That's another category mistake. And Stoneaker takes the same line, I think. While Perry construes belief states as having structure and involving concepts as constituents, corresponding to the structure and constituents of the sentence which expresses the state, Stoneaker insists that concepts, objects, and senses and semantic structure, I quote, are part of the means by which content is determined and not components of the content itself, which may be true on certain notions of content, but the issue is it true of all? So he complains that Perry's notion of a mode of presentation or a way of thinking, I quote, blurs the line between the content of a representation and the relation between the representation and its content. So that's a quote. And another one you have here on your handout, that's under 5, in which he says very much the same sort of thing. He says, Perry's way of distinguishing content of belief from way of believing distorts the phenomena, locating an aspect of Ralph's conception of what the world is like on the wrong side of the line. So he thinks there is some aspect of the content that Perry puts elsewhere than in the content, and that's a mistake. That's what he says now. Ralph's way of representing Orchat is essential to the way he tells the world to be like, and not just to the manner in which you represent the world. Now, Perry's distinction between the content of belief and the way it is believed is inspired from Kaplan's character-content distinction, But Stojanovic believes this is a misleading analogy. And here's the quote. You have it also on your handout. The motivation for the distinction in Kaplan's theory, as I understand it, is something like this. We need to distinguish the information conveyed or represented from the means by which it is conveyed or represented. The information conveyed in an utterance, what is said, is of course dependent on the meaning of the sentence, but one cannot identify content with meaning, since what is said may depend upon other things as well. Specifically, what is said may depend on information available in the environment of the utterance. Perry describes this distinction between objects of belief and belief states in a similar way as a distinction between what is believed and the way it is believed. But the point of Perry's distinction must be different, since the lesson of the examples of essentially indexical belief, the example that motivate Perry's account, is that indexicals are essential to the information itself and are not just part of the means used to represent it. And indeed, that we've seen when we saw what actually the lesson of the Perry shift was, compared to the older view that was just a matter of the ways of talking and not really a matter of content. So that's the Stojanovic objection, and I'd like to respond to it. So I don't know whether John would respond in the same way, so this is my way of looking at things. So first, I agree that psychological states are vehicles. They are representations. And that I also agree that vehicles should not be confused with the content they carry. That's right. There is a distinction between the content and the vehicle. All that is right. I also agree with Stojanovic that indexicality has got to be a feature of content at some level, because that's what the essential indexicality is all about. But I think the Perry picture is not threatened in the least. For the vehicles have roles in the cognitive economy. I'm using role in a slightly different but equivalent way. I won't go into the difference here. The vehicles have roles in the cognitive economy, and these roles generate content. The vehicles are supposed to do certain things, which they can do only if the context in which they are deployed satisfies certain conditions. So the vehicles carry presuppositional content. Their deployment means something, namely that the context satisfies the conditions, whatever they are, on which their correct functioning relies. And that aspect of the overall content of the vehicle is context independent. It's a property of the vehicle. That's context independent. In contrast to the truth-conditional content, which constitutively depends upon what I've called the external factor. So consider, for example, referential expressions. What they contribute to the thought construed as vehicle is arguably a mental file. A mental file is undoubtedly a vehicle of content. It's a mental representation which carries referential content if all goes well. A mental file refers to some object in the environment through epistemically rewarding relations or ER relations that the file exploits. Since the role of a file is to track an object through some ER relation to the object, any deployment of the file will presuppose that there is some such object and that the relation obtains. For example, the deployment of a demonstrative file, that glass, presupposes that the subject, me, is perceptually tracking some object. The file may be deployed even, as in this case, if the contextual relation is not met, the contextual requirement is not met, and no reference is determined, because in this case there is no glass in front of me, there is nothing there. But in all cases, whether successful or empty, the deployment of the file presupposes that the condition is satisfied. That presupposition has content, and that content accounts for behavior. If, for example, my reaching for the non-existent glass. Maybe I should go a little faster, should I? Okay, so I'll skip this. On this picture, the internal component is indeed a vehicle, but it's a vehicle whose deployment carries presuppositional content. So there is a vehicle, but there is a content that goes with it, and that corresponds to this component in the Austinian proposition, this centered thing. That content must be distinguished from the referential content also carried by the file, the object to which the file refers, if the context satisfies the presupposition. And the same distinction between two aspects of content can be made for belief state, and that corresponds to Perry's distinction between what is believed and how it is believed, so let me skip that as well. I would like to mention that Perry's distinction between the two dimensions of content is analogous not only to Kaplan's content character distinction, but also to the distinction which is drawn in presupposition studies between what is at issue and what is not. So there is a narrow notion of content, what is said, which corresponds to the at issue content exclusively, subject matter content, as Perry puts it, not to all the information that is conveyed by an utterance. And the same is true for thought. So someone who judges that is read is not thinking of the demonstrative relation in which she stands to the object she's thinking about. The thought she thinks is about the object, not about her relation to it. And that, of course, is compatible with the fact that the subject is or may be aware of the relation. So I think that when Perry talks of the content of belief as opposed to the way of believing, it is that narrow notion of content that he has in mind. So it can be conceded to, that's the notion of all content, basically. So it can be conceded to Stonehaker that how the subject represents Orcutt is essential to the way he takes the world to be. It's essential to what he believes in a certain sense, in a broad sense. Ralph thinks of Orcutt through two distinct mental files, and the existence of these two files in his mental economy means that for him there are two distinct persons. One he takes to be a spy, the other not. So for Stonehaker, we can represent Ralph's global belief state by saying that in each of his doxastic alternatives, there is a guy with a brown hat who he has seen on several occasions who is a spy, and another guy seen at the beach who is not. But in contrast to Stonehaker, Perry is not talking about Ralph's global, holistic belief state, what he takes the world to be like, or what he believes in general, but about the local belief state one is in when one thinks a given or current thought, such as the thought, that guy is a spy. When Ralph assertively entertains that thought, he comes to believe something which is true if only if Orcutt is a spy. The relation between the man in the brown hat file and in Ralph's mind and some individual in Ralph's environment determines who Ralph's thought is about, namely Orcutt, but the thought is not about the relation, it is about Orcutt. The relation is presupposed rather than part of the at-issue content of the judgment. Now, to conclude, let me say another aspect that has not emerged in John's discussion this morning, and maybe not in his most recent writing, so I'm glad to mention it here because I think that's an important feature of his thought, is that the distinction between the two dimensions of content is ultimately a difference in attitude. So about the diagonal proposition, which in his framework, Stonehaker's framework, carried the non-at-issue content about the subject's relation to what he's thinking about, Stonehaker says in various places that they are not a special kind of proposition, but the special way of determining a proposition. And commenting on Stonehaker's approach, John remarks, and you've got this quotation here under 7, he says basically that we do not generally believe the reflexive truth conditions is the same as the diagonal proposition, more or less, of our beliefs. And he says, I'm inclined to reserve beliefs for proposition about the subject matter. So the attitude we have toward the other aspect of content, this presuppositional content, is not the same attitude. It's a different attitude. There is content there. We have an attitude towards that content, but it's not the same attitude. And the last quote I have on the handout are examples in which Perry emphasizes the difference between, for example, under 8, between being able to think of a thing or person in virtue of some role it plays in one's life and being able to articulate that role in thought or speech and think of it as the thing or person playing that role in one's life. And the following quote is about attunement as a relation that our self-notions have to ourselves, the relation that our self-notions have to ourselves or our perceptions have to the object they are of. And he says that attunement to the relation does not require belief or thought about the relation. It requires know-how, not knowledge that. And I'll stop here.